Our devotion today comes from Exodus chapter 1. Before we look at it, remember today to be in prayer for Lonnie and Cindy Hazlett and Kevin Cooper. So a couple months ago, we looked at the book of Genesis. We went all the way through that, and of course at the end, we see the story of Joseph and how God brought him to that place of prominence in Egypt in order to save his family from that time of famine. Remember Joseph's brothers and Jacob, they come to Egypt to live during that famine, and God rescues them in that way. Of course, the book of Exodus continues on that story thread for us. We see that Jacob's descendants are still there. They're the Israelites. They're living in Egypt, but there's this new ruler who has taken over, and he doesn't remember who Joseph is, and he doesn't care. What he does care about is he sees this nation growing up right beside Egypt, and he's worried about them. He sees them multiplying and that they're blessed by God, and he says, you know what, this might be a problem. We need to do something to subjugate these people and keep them from becoming more powerful than us. Of course, what he doesn't realize is that these are God's chosen people that he's deciding to make war with. That's why they're blessed. That's why they're multiplied. The promises of God that he made to Israel, they're not in the promised land where he wanted them to be, and things don't look quite like he said they were going to, but his promises are still there. And so when this ruler in Egypt decides he's basically going to make war on Israel, what he doesn't realize, he's going to find out that he's fighting against God. I think that is a common thread that we see all throughout Scripture. We see people think that they can make war on God's people, and what ends up happening is that God continues to bless his people. You can't fight against God's plan. But that's what we see here in this chapter. We see, of course, that at first he decides, I'm just going to subjugate these people. We're going to hard press them. We're going to make them build stuff for us. And of course, it doesn't have the desired effect that he thinks it's going to, because God is for his chosen people. His promises still stand, and they continue to multiply. And then you see that they get real desperate. And this ruler orders that they start trying to, they start executing these male children. And absolutely horrific, but we know that's what's going to happen again. We know when at the birth of Christ, but evil does not want to let goodness prevail. And I think we see a pretty incredible, how far evil will go to stop God's plan from happening. As I read through this chapter today, I think that's what it reminds me the most of. I mean, what God did with the nation of Israel, because they're in this place where they shouldn't have thrived. They were slaves, and their future should have been hopeless. And yet God had made promises to them, and he's going to show that he was able to take them from a futureless nation and make them what he promised that they were going to be. And he was going to do that in his power. And it didn't matter what ruler or what evil force tried to stand up against that. It was only going to prove that God could do what he wanted. And they're going to multiply more and more and more and be blessed by God more and more and more. So I'm thankful for this passage today, because it reminds me of the sovereignty and the power of God, and that you can't fight against God, and you certainly don't want to. And I think we certainly see that today. The more people rail against God's people, against his word, against the church, the more they're persecuted, the more they flourish. You can't fight against God. I'm thankful for this passage today. If God spoke something to you out of it, I'd ask that you leave us a message on Facebook, on YouTube. Let's minister to one another. God bless you guys.